Welcome back to the Man Cave. We're carrying on our conversation, looking at the ancient Hebrew scriptures and looking at some of the heroes to try and tease out good principles for us modern men on what we ought to do and how we ought to behave in order to be what we ought to be as men, and to kind of get past some of that stuff that's been lost as we look for ways to find what masculinity ought to be. Not just what it traditionally has been, and certainly not what it is now, but what it should be. And so as we looked so far, I kind of walked through some stories like David's mighty men, and we've looked at the first judge named Othniel in the book of Judges. We're going to look again back into that book and carry on in our examination of what's being revealed about proper masculinity in these stories. So the first three principles that we came to were, firstly, that a man needs a king. He can't serve himself. He needs someone to serve, or something to serve. The second principle that we got out of this was that man must be set apart for service at whatever cost to his king. Set apart for service to his king at whatever cost, I should say. And the third one is that a man must respect his wife and integrate her into his service of that king. And they might pull together, yoked together in service of their king. Now we're going to look at another character today, and this guy's name is Ehud. And it's one of the more interesting stories that is presented to us in Scripture. So you've got this continual kind of story arc that's going on in Judges. The people reject what is right. They fall apart because they have no king, and they don't honor God. And then they start serving themselves, and they become weak, and then they're overtaken by another nation, by another king. And in this particular case, this is what's happened. And there's this king named Eglon, and he's taken over the valleys and the low places down around Jericho area. So the people, they are now subjugated, and they're suffering, and they're looking for a deliverer. Now, Othniel, the first judge, was a dude. He was a serious war leader and a man's man, and he was the kind of the archetype of the hero, much like you would expect from a Greek epic. But you're going to see as we go through the stories here that not all of these heroes fit that kind of Greek epic mold. And this guy's one of them. So we had Othniel, the great man hero, and he did lead Israel back, and he delivered them, but only for a time. And then they fell away again after he had gone on. And now, all of a sudden, you have this guy named Ehud. And Ehud, it says, was a left-handed man. And he's sent to the king with tribute from the Israelites. And then as he goes to walk back to the river crossing of the Jordan with the king, he says, "Look, I have a secret that I'm going to have to tell you." And so Eglon's like, "Okay, that's interesting." So he takes him back to his palace, probably just a small structure, really. I mean, king in the context, we're talking about probably 1200, 1300 BC, smaller kingdoms, let's put it that way. So he takes him into his home, his place of rule, and he takes him into the upper chamber. And then Ehud, who's hidden a sword on his right thigh, reaches down and he grabs hold of it. And it's like, "I have a message from God for you," he says. And he gets up from his seat and he walks over and he drags out this short sword and he drives it through his stomach. And it says that the fat closed over the hilt. He drove it in so deep. And then he escaped out the window after locking the doors and runs to the ford. And then it tells us some bizarre details. It'll all make sense once we kind of tease it out, that the king basically defecated, crapped his pants when he died. And then Ehud is running. He's running. He gets to the ford, which is a couple of kilometers away from Jericho where they were, or the Jericho area, and sounds the horn. The people come down from the hillsides, and they meet the armies of Eglon's men at the ford, and they catch them in the crossing, and they slay them all, and they drive those people out of their land. So the conquerors are overthrown. Now, of course, the thing about him having crapped his pants is that his servants were, it says, waiting outside the door and believed that he was relieving himself in the cool of the upper room until it took a really long time, and then they got uncomfortable, and then they broke the door down and found him dead. So there's a lot to unpack here. There's quite an interesting story that's being given to us. So you've got this guy Ehud, and he's a left-handed man. Well, what's the point of telling us that he's left-handed? Now, if you look at a lot of people who will talk about this story, and they'll say something like, well, it was considered to be bad to be left-handed in the old times. Well, maybe. There's not a lot of good evidence contemporaneously that that view was held in Israel at that time. I think that they're missing the point, and I think I'll explain to you what it is. There's a hint for us. If you go later in the same book, it tells us that the Benjamites had a group of slingers who were elite slingers, and they could hit a hare at a dozen, or I think 20 paces. And so not a bunny hare, but they could put a hare out and strike the hare with a rock, and they could do that at 20 paces consistently. And it says they were all left-handed men. So something that may not automatically present itself to your mind or others looking at this is that if you are left-handed in the ancient world, you can't stand in a battle line with other men, because your shield must cover them, and your right arm carries your spear or your sword or whatever it is that you're using. So your next man to your right is then going to cover your weapon side with his shield. That's how battle lines work. It's how they've always worked until we came up with rifles and started, doing things a little bit differently. But I'll tell you something, like I actually shoot left-handed, and I carry my rifle left-handed. So when I would go out and we'd march, I'd always have to be on the left-hand side of a column, because if I was in the middle or on the right, my rifle would be clanking against the rifle of the guy beside me. Whether you're carrying it in your half-ready position, you're bonking into the other guy's muzzle with the butt of your rifle, or if on patrol I was carrying one-handed with a strap, you're still banging your rifle into the guy beside you. So it creates an awkwardness there. We don't have a problem with that, obviously, because we don't actually guard ourselves. We just use cover and movement to protect ourselves from bullets. So on the battlefield, we're quite a bit spread out, so it's not really a problem now. But you can get a sense of what a problem it would be to be a left-handed dude trying to fight in a battle line in the ancient world, because, your spear's going to be mangling with the other guy's spear beside you. If you are using a sword, then you're going to be swinging on the same side as the guy to your left, and you're going to possibly chop his hand off or get your hand chopped off. and you can't guard him if you're using a shield. So there's a fundamental problem if you can't learn to be ambidextrous and use your right hand for wielding a weapon, then you're not going to be a warrior or a war leader. And that's the significance of Ehud being left-handed in this story. You had Othniel, and Othniel was the mighty warrior of Israel. And he delivered them, and they fell away. And then you have Ehud, and he can't be that kind of hero. He can't be because he wouldn't have been trained for war. Now, it's possible, like the other Benjamites, he might have been trained to be a skirmisher, because being left-handed it's not a problem for skirmishers. They're going to be out in front and widely spaced to avoid getting hit by incoming projectiles from the other skirmishers, because you would always send your skirmishing line out first, and they would try and overwhelm the other side's skirmishing line with projectiles, and whether it was javelins or slings or bow and arrow, they would throw at each other until one side dominated, and then the infantry would come in, and the skirmishers would either go out to the flanks and try to continue to harass, or they would retire, because once the two infantry lines are engaged, you can't throw stones or arrows or javelins without risking hitting your own men, right? So they would continue to skirmish and try and attrit the infantry of the other side while they would close with you. So all of this kind of describes the problem with Ehud feeling called to deliver Israel, to be the hero, but he would not have been trained in war, and he would not have risen in respect as a war leader because of his left-handedness. So he can't do the Othniel thing, and he can't go and meet the enemies in battle at the lead of an army. So instead, what does he do? He goes and he takes the tribute, the money that's being given to Ehud by the Israelites, and then through subterfuge, he sneaks a sword in that's strapped to his thigh under his clothes, and he brings him into the closed room, and he stabs him in the guts and leaves the sword there, and then runs back and says, "Guess what, fellas? The king's dead. The armies are coming. It's time to fight." And then everybody rises up and fights. So there's a really key principle for us to take away from that. What Ehud did isn't being presented as something wrong, because this is war. Deception in war is fundamental. It's essential. It's one of the key principles of war. Assassinating the leader of an oppressive enemy is not being presented as something base or wrong, but it is not honorable in the way that the world would consider these things. So if you're looking for a principle from that, it is, don't let your weakness keep you from your service to the king. Don't let your weakness keep you from service, but find a way. Ehud found a way. He didn't have the means or the ability to deliver or to rescue using his might or his position as a war leader, so he found a way. He used cunning instead, and he achieved the liberation of Israel. There's a second principle that I'm going to draw out for you here, which is absolutely fundamental to understanding what's going on here in this story. So Ehud's bringing money from the Israelites to buy peace. Now, do you see what he does? Do you get what's actually happening in the context of that little tidbit of information? Is that the people of Israel are not prepared to go to war. They know they don't want to be under oppression anymore, but they don't have the parts, the guts, to go and to fight. So what he does is he forces the issue. He goes in and he kills the king, because now the people of Israel have no choice but to fight. If they didn't fight, the armies are going to come and they're going to exact vengeance for the death of their king on all of the Israelites. It's just how they rolled. They weren't going to take that kind of an offense lying down. So the next principle is doing what is right when everyone's watching. You always hear that concept of integrity is doing what's right when nobody's looking. That's not very hard. I mean, you need to know what right is. And if you go back to my first video, you'll see I've taken pains to explain that that isn't integrity either. It's a symptom of integrity. And you'll see what true integrity actually is, and understand that you need to be fully integrated into your values in order to have integrity. Nevertheless, one of the expressions of integrity, which is fundamentally important and probably the hardest, is doing the right thing when everyone is watching, but they don't want you to do it. You get it? Right? So I know what is right, even though it's unpopular, so I will do it anyway, even though I know that people are going to be upset with me, they're going to be unhappy, they might even hurt me or kill me for doing this thing. That's real manliness right there, is knowing what is right and doing it no matter what the cost is. So here's Ehud. Now, something that's worth kind of thinking about, there's a reason for all the details in this story. And the reason why it goes to such lengths to describe the fact that the king dropped a turd in his drawers as he died, and then the people were standing outside thinking he was using the bathroom. When Ehud gets to the ford and starts blowing the trumpet, the people come down just in time as a mass. They pick up their arms and they rush down the hillsides from their villages to come to the ford, and they arrive just in time to catch the king's armies as they're coming through the ford and coming up out. If the thing hadn't happened where the servants waited for a long time because they thought he was using the toilet, they would have already left and they would have got to the ford and crossed it first, and then there would have been a terrible, terrible battle on equal footing between the two sides. But as this took place in the way that it did, Ehud was able to make it all the way back and able to bring the Israelite armies down and to meet them so that they could actually be in place in time to stop them before it was an equal fight. Which all just goes to show that what the story is trying to tell us is that God was ultimately responsible for preserving Ehud's life, because he was able to get away because of that confusion and no one could have caught him, on a chariot or something, and B, that God was ultimately responsible for ensuring that the cost was not grievous upon the Israelites, even in spite of their unwillingness to actually come and fight as they should have done against their oppressors. So it kind of tells you that Ehud had to know that most likely he was going to die, and that even if he didn't, most likely the king's armies were going to be able to get to the ford and cross it and to fight them in their own villages, and that there would be a grievous loss of life. Nevertheless, he chose to do it because he saw that it was the right thing that needed to be done, and that it was better to lose life and gain freedom than it was to continue in subservience to an evil and oppressive king that wasn't their king and was abusing them and treating them ultimately like slaves. So there we have it. You've got these true and great principles for yourself that you can draw out of this story, that even if you don't have someone else's strengths, you do have means of accomplishing the right thing. So understand what your strengths are, understand what your weaknesses are, and work within those in order to accomplish what is right at whatever cost. That's what it is to be a man, not to be the kind of person who sits back and says, well, I would do it if I had Achilles' strength, or Achilles' speed and Ajax's strength, then I would go and fight. But, I'm just not made that way. No, wrong. Is something happening which is wrong? Then you are required to step in and do something about it. It doesn't mean that you have to walk up to the 300-pound boxer and challenge him to a proper fight. It means that you need to find a way to do something to stop him if he is oppressing, bullying, abusing others. You must find means. And if those means ultimately may put you in enormous risk, it's still what you should do, right? All that is required for evil to prosper is that good men do nothing. It isn't good enough to simply say, well, someone else with the right skills needs to handle that, because I'm not the guy. I haven't been gifted with the right skills. No, go and do something. Figure it out. You have skills. Whatever they are, you've got them. You have strengths. Now you need to find out how you're going to use what you are in service of what is right and good. And then you will have truly grasped a hold of what it means to truly embody masculinity, standing up, accepting the risk, doing the right thing. And even if you don't think anyone else is going to stand with you, you must do it. I will jump in, and there is another judge who comes right after, and I'm not going to do something on him, but it bears mentioning because it follows. It's necessary to see the whole flow of the narrative, that we understand what he represents. So Shamgar is the next judge, and Shamgar is actually the name of a foreign god. So what that means, which isn't obvious if you were to read it yourself without the help of archaeological evidence that we've got to explain it, and contemporary documents, etc. Shamgar was therefore not born an Israelite, or at least if he was, his parents had basically completely departed from worshiping Jehovah because they chose to name their son a foreign deity's name, right? So what that means is that Shamgar also expressed these principles. He was not an Israelite, or if he was from a compromised family, and yet he did what was right, notwithstanding that he would have obviously then had to go against his family to do that, and probably his people. It's most likely that he was either a foreigner or he was only Jewish or Israelite on his mother's side, that she might have been taken as a slave, and so there he is now, defying his family and probably his people, his patrilineal lineage, to do what is right, even though it's going to cost him being ostracized from his own people. And this Shamgar goes and he kills 600 Philistines, it says, with a club, with an ox goad. And so he was a serious, rugged fella, obviously, who delivered Israel from the oppression of the Philistines, probably around the same time. that this story here took place in a different part of Israel. So there you have it. Your principles for today, and we'll add them all together, is you must, if you want to be a man who is full of honor, who is right and good, who can be satisfied completely in who he is, you must have a king, serve something that is greater than you, and that something, the only something that is worthy, as I will keep repeating, is God. And in your service to your king, you must be prepared to serve at whatever cost, to be set apart for service at whatever cost, ready for service at whatever cost, that you must respect your wife and work together with her in that service, integrate her into your service to that king, that you must not let your weaknesses keep you from service or from doing what is right in your service to that king. And finally, that you must do the right thing in service to your king, even when everyone is watching and doesn't want you to do it. So we're getting there. We're starting to build a list of good principles for ourselves on what it looks like to be a real man, one that can stand in honor. So as always, by all means, throw questions into the comments section. I'm happy to throw up a video if the question's very complicated to try and answer it more fully, or I'll try and answer you in the brief form in the comments section if that's more appropriate. And I look forward to meeting you again next time, where we'll get to talk about Deborah, the woman judge of Israel, and everything that is expressed in that little piece of this story. Great seeing you, and take care.